My name is Kate Cox. I am the editor of the New Food Economy. If you're not familiar with our publication, we're a nonprofit news organization out of New York City. We publish every day news context and analysis with a small team of about 8 reporters and editors whose full-time job it is to investigate the forces shaping how and what America is eating. So it's a pretty exciting time to do what we do right now. You can find us at newfoodeconomy.org. But enough about me. Here are 3 terrific panelists that are going to lead us through what I hope is going to be a fun and provocative sort of off-label food policy discussion about what should be on the 2020 ballot versus what might be, if anything. So let me introduce Urvashi Rangan from Grace Communications, Martine Limos from National Young Farmers Coalition, and Jillian Seaman from Green America. I thought I'd start with just a very brief sort of state of the Food and Ag Union at, as of this morning, 471 days from the election. So, yeah, time's a ticking. And as of this morning, we still have 25 Democratic candidates and 1 Republican challenger whose name will be named here, Bill Weld, because he is taking on a heroic task. And what the 4 of us were talking about how sort of interesting it is that food and ag is making any news at all. Back in late March, we covered the presidential forum in Storm Lake, Iowa, which is really the first of its kind, having the so-called front runners come in to Middle America and talk about food and ag agenda. And very large on that conversation roster was consolidation, both corporate and in meatpacking in particular. Antitrust and corporate consolidation have been a pretty big focus for Senator Sanders, for Senator Warren, and for Senator Booker, who's been talking about consolidation for the last year or so with Mike Lee from Utah. Those seem to me pretty unusual food and ag policy conversations to be on the agenda. They continue to be on the agenda. And then as of this week, Joe Biden has released his plan for rural America, such as it is, and that joins Sanders and Warren's plans for rural America. So much of this is tied up in rural resilience conversation, but we thought we would kind of get off brand and talk about what isn't currently on the ballot discussion plate, what should be. And I'm going to have these guys walk us through a couple of things. So I want to start with the census and frame it in the larger discussion of the census. Let's assume that all of us know why censuses are important. They have an awful lot to do with who gets money to do what in this country. But I want to ask if any of you know there's an agricultural census. Okay, so there is one. And Martina, am I right? It was April of this year that the most recent census was released for agriculture?
So it was released in April. It's the 2017 census. It's released in 2019. The previous census was 2012. For our organization, it's a bit of a field day when the census comes out. We're really excited about it. Our organization is focused on the next generation of farmers and the pathways for new farmers to enter agriculture. So we were particularly interested in the average age of primary producers or primary operators. And we were actually expecting a bit of a decline in that. We were actually hoping to see the average age decline because more producers were being counted this year. Farmers could now put 4 producers on their farm, and we actually saw an increase. So the average age of the primary producer is now 59.4. We saw that farmers over 65 outnumber farmers under 35 by over 6-1. And then there's a ton of other statistics which are very bleak, but which I'll share. And
Could you give us the highlights of those bleak ones? Because I think what I'd like to do in talking about the census is help us connect the dots a little bit between the findings of a census and political outcomes, and get a sense of why this matters and who it matters for in particular.
Yeah, I mean, I think the stats that really stand out to me, we lost 63,000 farms. We lost 14 million acres of farmland, which is about half the area of New York State, about a quarter of Colorado, and that was over 5 years. We saw, to that point around consolidation, that farms between 9 acres and 2,000 acres, those decreased, the number of farms. We saw an increase in farms between 1 to 9 acres and an increase in farms over 2,000 acres. So really, something everybody that's been working on agriculture knows, that we've been kind of hollowing out like the mid-sized farms, right? And we've been losing those farms. Farmers are getting started on very small acreage because it's impossible to, nearly impossible to purchase farmland in this country right now unless you have an exorbitant amount of wealth that you can rely on or a foundation of that wealth. And so for us, it was just a wake-up call, and also just a continuation of what we knew was happening, which is very difficult to get into farming. Farmers across the country are in crisis, and we saw net incomes just not where they need to be to support the next generation of farmers. So it's kind of dire, I would say. So I think I would frame it as, it really showed that we have a farm crisis. It showed the extent of it is national. We saw that challenge for young farmers. We know the challenge for existing farmers. We know consolidation is happening. We saw bright spots in local food and organic sales, which to us means that we should be incentivizing that more. Those are bright spots for our farm economy. Yeah.
I'm going to ask Jillian if you'd be interested in weighing in. So I'm right in saying that you were with USDA in the Civil Rights Office for the duration of Obama's term there? Okay. So the New Food Economy published a 2-year investigation about a month ago looking at how changes to census methodology have meant that some farmers, black farmers in particular, weren't counted, that it costs them money, it costs them loans, and it costs them land. And I wonder if you have thoughts on the current, or the most recent census, or any of the previous, or anything else you might like to say about who gets money for what and what's important about counting those people.
Well, yes, thank you. So in civil rights, we saw a lot of black farmers who were not counted. When we got into the administration, we had Pickford versus Glickman, which was the largest civil lawsuit for black farmers that we ended up paying out $1 billion in discrimination cases. Most of those farmers weren't counted. Today, I can't imagine that those people are being counted either. If anything, it's probably less than that. I know when I was there, we had, not only did we have Pickford, but we had Keep Siegel, which is the Native American lawsuits, Hispanic farmers, and women farmers, most of them who were not counted in the 2012 census. We were settling cases in 2009 and 2010 from 1981 to 1996. So that gives folks just a sense of what is really happening probably today.
And I think some of the changes in the methodology, which are nuanced and take many thousands of words to explain, as I've learned, but they're nuances that are incredibly important distinctions that, Martine, you mentioned specifically, that there's some changing in the way we're thinking about what a primary operator is. So, for instance, this year, I think, or this recent census was the first census where where we were permitted to count multiple operators in an operation. So saying that large-scale farms above 2,000 acres are increasing gives me a sense that multi-operator farms are probably a big portion of this. And they're a target for large-scale subsidies in return. Urvashi, do you want to say anything about this part of the conversation?
I'll just say that the census is definitely of immense interest, and when we don't count things, we don't correlate things properly. So that's the sort of secondary consequence of that. And so if you don't count black farmers, then it doesn't seem like there are any, and then you don't need to think about incentivizing what you should be or de-incentivizing what you should be. And so it's just one example, but the analyses that are done out of it can then be very misleading because the data that they're capturing is just not accurate.
Actually, hang on to that. So now we're going to do my favorite part of this discussion, which is I asked Urvashi to give us kind of like a flash primer on the key agencies at play here, because whether a Democrat or third-party candidate inherits the office in 2020 or whether the incumbent continues, they're going to be dealing with 2 or 3 regulatory bodies that have increasing influence in what ends up on our plates. So I kind of wanted Urvashi to talk a little bit about USDA, FDA, EPA, what they're doing, and yet she has this incredible flow chart that I kind of wish you could see, but she'll walk us through it.
Okay, I don't know if you can see it, but there's at least 25 cross lines on here. And, part of the problem is we have a very fragmented regulatory system when it comes to food. So I know we're here to talk about the ballot and food on the ballot, and that's super important, and I know we'll get to it. But wanted to just give you all a primer on whoever gets into office, what they're facing, and the agencies that are responsible. What's interesting about the government when it comes to food is that there's two kind of major operations going on. There's research that takes place in certain federal agencies, and they don't do policy often. And then there are the regulatory agencies that are making policy in food. And sometimes they don't talk to one another. Often they don't. I remember at Consumer Reports briefing federal agencies on food safety stories, and you'd be amazed at the difference in response from them, from the Centers for Disease Control to the Food and Drug Administration to the USDA. I used to have a little ticker on, oh, totally silent from that one, or, oh, thank you so much for doing this important work from another one. And different agencies have different postures when it comes to some of the concerning issues we have out there. So, on my right side of my list, I have labeling, organic, WIC, and SNAP. So those are the subsidies for food, processed foods, new ingredients, farm research, school food, food safety, pesticides, meat production, food labeling, meat labeling, animal feed, and fertilizers. And sewage sludge is in there too for fertilizers. So that just kind of gives you a quick sort of broad painting of some of the issues in food that we have to deal with and regulate. The Food and Drug Administration is under the Department of Health and Human Services, along with the National Institutes of Health and the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences and the National Toxicology Program. I mention those because the FDA is the only one out of all of those that actually does policy making. And even though they are supposed to be informed by the NTP, National Tox Program, and the NIH, we often see a disconnect in the work and in the understandings of those different agencies. So FDA is responsible for a lot of food labeling, not meat. That's USDA. They are responsible for processed food safety and new ingredients that go into them. That is under a system called Generally Recognized as Safe, or GRAS. And it's pretty much a defunct system. It doesn't operate at all. And FDA has really farmed that out to companies to decide whether new ingredients in their products are actually safe or not. And companies don't even have to disclose them to the to the FDA. And at this time, we've got a whole new generation of products out there that are putting lots of new ingredients into the market. They're not being overseen at all at this point. And we have a lot of new proteins in our dietary intake going on that a lot of people don't even know about. So the Food and Drug Administration's done nothing on all of those. On farm research, it tends to be USDA, but with the new Food Safety Modernization Act, it's often FDA. And again, those two agencies have to come to terms with one another on a lot of those issues. Pesticides is an environmental protection agency area, and that poor agency has really been squashed in this administration. But the approval of pesticides, the use of pesticides, all comes under them. And synthetic fertilizers actually comes under EPA as well. And you may or may not know that a lot of municipalities will take their sewage sludge and use that as fertilizer. So EPA sets all of the standards for that sewage sludge, and they're pretty lenient at the moment. We allow a lot of heavy metals and other contaminants to be in fertilizers, and that's why, again, it's important that we start thinking about that area as well. Finally, not quite finally, USDA really does much on meat. And meat production and labeling, and Food and Drug Administration does the feed for the animals, and again, they farm that out to the industry. So there's an industry group called AAFCO, AAFCO, and they are the group every year that puts out an encyclopedia of acceptable animal ingredients. So spent baked goods, distiller grains, plastic as roughage. These are all acceptable ingredients in animal feed, along with chicken poop, actually, as well. So they are responsible for that. And then and then finally, I just want to mention the Federal Trade Commission, which is responsible for labeling and marketing in a lot of cases, and they'll work in conjunction with some of those other agencies. So no matter who's in the office, no matter what food issue it is, you can see that like the way it's going to get dealt with is through a series of efforts among those agencies, not just anyone.
And since we're talking about FDA, USDA in particular, I always find it fascinating, just to throw this out. FDA is actually responsible for regulating, I think, more than 70% of the U.S. food system. And that's pretty extraordinary considering what they're responsible for and what the agency is responsible for. It's been an interesting time. It was an interesting time for FDA under Scott Gottlieb. There were multiple efforts made to work across agencies in dealing with lab-created meat and who was going to regulate that. Also in dealing with whether we're ever going to decide to universalize and officially define terms like natural for use on labels. Those are some of my favorite things to delve into. Did you want to add something?
I did want to add something. What had frustrated me so much at USDA was when everyone was talking about high fructose corn syrup and getting it out of our food system and getting it out and going to FDA to say, let's regulate this. It's not regulated. It's just called something else. It's called inverted sugar. It's called, if you look at the labeling and the restrictions behind it, what FDA has done is just allowed it to be called something else. So just be careful in what you buy. It's really scary. Just because it's a federal agency, it doesn't mean that it's regulated towards the betterment of our health.
And before we move into the part of the discussion that we've all agreed we want to give some substantial time to, which is the climate crisis and how we can approach that on the ballot, I did want to bring up labeling for a moment. I mean, that's its own panel times 50. But specifically one issue that we may see again, which would be country of origin labeling on meat. And that's a persistent concern, particularly as it relates to grass-fed and some labels that American eaters are pretty wedded to spending money on. And I know, Urvashi, we talked about just bringing that part of the discussion up first, let's talk about what COOL is. Sure. And why people are concerned.
So COOL is country of origin labeling, and it's a law that went into effect that covered a bunch of different commodities that the old 1940s and 50s trade tariff laws didn't cover. Also, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms covers origin labeling for alcohol. So again, that's another fragmented kind of system. But I can't remember what year it was, a few years ago or 5 years ago now, Canada and Mexico challenged the U.S. on that particular law at the World Trade Organization. And they prevailed by saying that it was too much work to add all of that labeling onto meat. And it was that, a lot of the meat in this country will be raised in one side of the border, maybe slaughtered on another side of the border, finished somewhere else. So it's quite relevant, actually. And farmers who are farming here and finishing here and using all of the really good systems are a little bit shortchanged in that market because of the lack of good country of origin labeling. So if you see certified labels like American Grass-Fed Association or other animal welfare labels like Certified Humane as well as Animal Welfare Approved, they generally have that origin information verified on there, and that's a way for people to get to that answer. In the meantime, we've got a big policy problem going on. I remember talking to the U.S. trade reps, and I couldn't believe they were actually pushing for country of origin labeling at the time. And I know at Consumer Reports we did a lot of surveys showing that more than 90% of people want to know where their food comes from. And so for such a high demand for the government not to do that is really shocking. And it's something in this ballot election we should be demanding and looking for, that we want to know where our food is produced. And this shouldn't be an international issue. This is our national issue, national policy. We passed the law, and we should be able to enact it. But it is meat right now that is the big problem. And I'll also just say that there are challenges when you, and it's a loophole in the law, which is that if you reprocess here in this country, you can call it made in the USA. So you do need to be careful if we import a bunch of vegetables from overseas and cut it up and stick it in a bag and freeze it, you can actually say it's a product of the United States. So if you want to shop according to origin, make sure you take a little bit of a deeper look if it's a mixed type of product, whether that's ground meat, where a lot of, in one package of ground meat, you can have a lot of animals in there who were raised in multiple different places, or a bag of mixed produce.
Yeah, that's a that's a tough one. Processed here can be currently described as a product of the USA, even if it was grown in Brazil or grown in Australia. And that is something that has directly affected smaller scale producers, because if they are a grass-fed operation here, they're investing the money into doing that, but they're outpaced by larger scale operations from another country, it's a concern. And it is really a concern of a pretty significant portion of smaller scale U.S. farmers. I'm going to pivot into a conversation about regenerative agriculture, which is seeing movement on some state and local levels, but that we haven't seen a big federal move to it. But before we enter that discussion, I think it's critical to point out another thing that has happened at USDA that is deeply troubling, which is that the agency has decided to move the Economic Research Service, which is its only independent research body. It affects, some thousands of workers. They're going to move the agency to Kansas City, and workers have been told there, we're talking about climate scientists, we're talking about ag economists, the folks who provide Congress in particular with independent information about the state of the American food system. That agency is being moved out of the Beltway. That is a final decision. And workers had until, I think, Joe, am I right, earlier this week, Tuesday, to agree or not agree to be moved. If they didn't agree, they're out. That is an issue to watch that's finally starting to get some national media attention. But it's critically important, I think, moving into the ballot, to understand that all of the decision-making that Congress does comes from information that they're provided by our own agencies. And so if our independent agencies have been moved out of the way because what they're finding is contrary to the current administration's script, that's a concern. And that's especially true when it comes to the climate crisis and when it comes to farming, resilience farming. So I want to see if one of you would be willing to define, as you see it, regenerative agriculture for folks before we start talking about what that looks like. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Informal poll. Who could define it? Regenerative agriculture right now. Great. Okay. So yeah, perfect.
Okay, great. So,
Yeah.
well, regenerative ag is the new buzzword out there, and it is not to eschew things like organic. It's really building out on that, on some of the principles that we were using. So regenerative ag means that we leave the land in actually a better state than we came to it. Sustainable, you can kind of thinking of do no harm. In order to regenerate the land, and really we talk about soil a lot of the time because it starts there. And if you don't have healthy soils and your soil can't regenerate and you're not building topsoil, the rest of the system can't stand on that in a healthy way. So regenerative systems start with that and using practices that cultivate soil and add fertility into the soil. And the science is really exciting these days on what we can do and how fast we can do it. After spending some time out at Piscinus Ranch on what they call a learning journey, it's pretty amazing to see how fast a sheep grazing vineyard can build topsoil. I think it was 5% in 5 years. They have some insane numbers. And these research farms and farmers who are on the progressive edge are really demonstrating that we can do this. We only have 60 years of soil left to grow our food, fertility-wise. So we talk a lot about climate these days because that's the lens in which everybody is looking at this, but it's really, whether you address climate or any of the other issues, it comes down to the soil health and regenerating that. So what we do on the land, what we put on it, the chemical inputs and everything we're doing to the environment, the pollinators, the types of fertilizers that we use, those are all coming under now regenerative production practices and what we need to be focused on. But regenerative also includes some other components that organic really has not tackled, which is social justice and community health, and also animal welfare. And making sure that those are also included when we're talking about what a truly regenerative system is. Because if it's bad for the workers and it's bad for the pollinators, it's not regenerative. And so this is hopefully a way to finally get our arms around this system that we need to be focused on. And we at Grace have a booth here called Foodprint, and regenerative is sort of centered around that. But leveraging your foodprint and understanding that it's all of these different factors. It's not just one of them in making sure that we elevate our food systems and really hit that point we need to, so that we can actually grow food beyond our generation.
Martine, I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about the coalition of folks you're working with and how you're thinking about regenerative agriculture, how you're talking about it as it relates to climate change, opportunities, challenges.
Yeah, for many of our farmers, many of them are first-generation farmers. Many of them are within the first 10 years of their farm business. I think many of them entered agriculture knowing that climate change is an issue and seeing agriculture as a solution, right? So I don't think they're coming into agriculture surprised by the climate crisis, surprised by the impacts. I think more so they're actually built businesses, got into agriculture to address climate change. So I think that's the lens that our farmers are bringing to this, is that they're already doing this work. They're already cover cropping. They're already thinking about these practices. They're thinking about incorporating indigenous practices that we knew and we know address soil health. They're thinking about, to the soil justice perspective, food justice perspective, they are thinking about their land in new ways. They're thinking about, shared, collective, cooperative opportunities. They're thinking about food access. They're integrating all these ideas. And I think regenerative as this idea of putting agriculture into right relationship among people with land is something that everybody's kind of focused on. I think our attempt to work on it at the federal level, we think there's limits right now. Honestly, to the ERS NEFA relocation, we had a farmer testify saying this is not in the interest of farmers, and that was not obviously taken into account. I don't think there's any farmer that necessarily needed those organizations to move to Kansas City. Our farmers depend on sound science. They want a USDA that's focused on climate, that is putting out climate research, that has a climate plan, and is not stifling the researchers that have the expertise and are willing to work on this. So on the federal level, there's a lot of defense that we're playing. On the state level, I think there's a lot of opportunity around soil health. I think there's interest in bringing farmers into the conversation and thinking about what soil health practices could be supported by state governments across the country. So we passed something in New Mexico this past year. There's states all across the country are taking on really interesting initiatives and approaching it with a really local perspective, which I think is really important. I think that's one of the concerns I have about regenerative, is that it can lend itself to a very one size fits all. And we know after many years of many different labels and many different standards and protocols that no one size fits all does not fit for all farms. And we need to have an approach that really takes into account the geography, the kind of business models that different farmers have, and brings farmers into the conversation so that those policies reflect their interest and their opportunities as well. So that's kind of been our work, is bringing farmers into that discussion, making sure they have a voice. Unfortunately, it did not work at the USDA level, at the federal level, to stop that change, but we think there's opportunity at the state level.
And I would like to piggyback on that because geography is a concern. So one of the practices of regenerative agriculture is no tilling or very low tillage. In Colorado and Houston, where there is clay, it'll be really hard to, if you have a large-scale farm, to not use a till. But you have to be really mindful and intentional with the way that it's used in order to regenerate the soil. So some of the practices when we talk about regenerative, no herbicides, no pesticides, no chemicals whatsoever. The use of cover crops, composting. These are things that can be done on a small scale or on a large scale. And I work with both the consumer and the supply chain side, where we work with with companies like Mega Food and Danone and Ben & Jerry's, who all have a commitment. Mega Food is a vitamin company, and their whole mantra is farmer to tablet, where most folks don't necessarily, when they think about the vitamin they're eating, they don't necessarily think about the farmer. So they try to make that connection. But a lot of these companies that we work with, and it's nice to see, like the Ben & Jerry's of the world, Danone, really have a commitment to climate and to regenerative agriculture. So it's really nice to see
I think
when we talk about regenerative.
That's a critical component of the conversation is a guaranteed market, right, for producers who have invested in regenerative. I think it's very worth pointing out that across the country, there's great interest in regenerative agriculture, both at the ground level, literally, and also to some degree, as Martin said, in policy circles. But it takes time to rehabilitate soil, and you can't always see it. You can definitely see it when it's been rehabilitated. You can taste it and feel it and smell it, but you can't. I can tell you from the media perspective, it's pretty tough to describe to people why it's critical if they cannot see firsthand what we're talking about when we talk about soil health. Luscious, lengthy root structures and all kinds of microbes. And things like integrated pest management, which is real and difficult to describe and kind of unsexy. And it gets us out of this system of quick return. So investing in the practices, and this is why I think what you said, Martina, is interesting. Younger beginning farmers in these practices helps them get started before they even get into the commodity system. But I do think companies seem to need to be a key component of the discussion, because a guaranteed market for these products is part of the deal. So I wonder if we want to talk a little bit about access, because that was the other issue that we thought we would try to tackle this morning before we move into a Q&A. Access is a word that is used ad nauseum in food, in good food conversations, but it means lots of different things. And so I asked each of these folks to talk a little bit about how they are thinking about access, whether it's at the eater level, whether it's at the producer level, or land or commercial real estate. Let's get a sense from each of you about how you're thinking about and working toward access, particularly on the policy side, what that looks like.
Yeah, for us, that statistic around the average age of the American producers, primary producers, I think for us is just a symptom of how difficult it is to access agriculture and a career in agriculture, how limited the pathways are, and how limited the opportunities are for young people that want to get into farming. And I think our work is really about expanding access, whether it's access to farmland, access to credit, access to student loan relief, access to healthcare. These are all things that increase the risk for any individual starting a small business and are really limiting to what a young person can do in terms of starting in agriculture. It's difficult to access land if you have student loan debt. So we're working on that to make sure that farmers can have a pathway to have student loan forgiveness for putting in service as farmers. We know farmland access is the challenge, so we're working at different models and working with an ecosystem of land trust organizations, state governments, national, federal government to look at ways that we can increase farmland access for the next generation. And also I think the other part of the census that we didn't talk about is that it was a census that counts farmers, but not all farmers, right? I think there's a different census, the National Agricultural Workers Census survey, which actually counts farm laborers. And in that, we saw that 80% of our farm labor is immigrant labor, often of Spanish-speaking descent. And that's not reflected in our national agricultural census, right? The identified Hispanic farmers account only for about 2% of that census, while they're 80% of farm labor. So I'm really interested in the way that when we talk about access, about opportunities to become farmers, it's obviously we have a tremendous challenge that we have 80% of our most skilled labor that's putting in the work, building our farm economy, yet they don't seem to have the access to own land, build equity in farmland. I think that's a tremendous part of our work, I think, is making sure that we are reflecting the, not just broadly increasing access to a next generation of farmers, but particularly looking at some of the specific ways that systemic discrimination has limited access, and particularly for farmers of color, indigenous farmers, and wanting to really address that, because I think that's fundamental to the challenges. Of the next generation of agriculture is the lack of compensation, the lack of value that we give to labor, and I think that's a really important part of our work.
I just was going to add that if the story continues to be there are more black farmers and more Hispanic farmers than ever, then policymakers say they're fine, right? They don't need funds. We don't need to allocate funds for land use and equipment and loans. And that's one of the reasons I think that taking a deeper look at the census is probably the most critically important thing we could do in the next 400 days.
To add on to the access issue is the access to the distribution system. So we have a very consolidated distribution system. Meat companies themselves, I think only 3 to 4 companies own 80 to 90% of most of each of the meat markets, and they can basically monopolize the distribution system, which then prevent small farmers and mid-sized farmers, especially those who are doing these kind of regenerative organic practices, from gaining the access to those markets. And so institutions who buy food, whether it's a school or a hospital or the government, will go to these big distributors, and those things will simply not be available to them. So the distribution system is really been constructed now in a way that limits access, and that really needs to be dealt with. And in these farmers who are taking the extra steps to do all of the hard work that we need to maintain the fertility and build the fertility in the soil, if they don't have access to the markets, then it doesn't even matter that they're doing it, and that's really a short-term opportunity for them. So getting that access into the markets is really important. And yeah, I'll leave it at that.
We all have very different views on access, which is really nice to see. When I think of food access, I think of it in its purest sense, where you have families who actually do not have access to food within a mile, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them. Where I had mothers when I was working at the USDA tell me they have to take 2 buses in order to get to a grocery store, and by the time they get back, their milk and juice, in Atlanta. This was in Atlanta, it's 100 degrees. By the time they get back home after a 1 hour and a half to 2 hour trip, it's spoiled. It's hot, and they can't give it to their kids. So when I think of food access, I think of we've really left out urban America when we talk at USDA, and I know it wasn't until the Obama administration where there were policies put in place that addressed urban America, and that was because Senator Debbie Stabenow was a proponent for urban America, and we were able to pass legislation in the Farm Bill that allowed access and dollars for urban America and programs that everyone can access, not just folks in rural America. So when I think of access, I really do think of families who do not have a grocery store, and I don't think a grocery store in every single city is the answer, but we need to think about farmers markets, and we need to think about other ways that are innovative that every single person that lives in this country can have access.
Okay. Okay, so I want to turn the discussion out to you all. And in the remaining 10 or 15 minutes we have, I hope you'll have specific questions for these folks. But also, as we stare down 400 days or so before the election, thinking about what to care about, what to advocate for, how to sort of shuffle through this, flowchart of agencies and issues and all of that. I'm wondering what it is that's front of mind for you in terms of policy, and what you'd like to see, and certainly if you have questions for any of these fine experts on just about everything food.
Questions? No one has questions? This is amazing.
Just talk a little bit about policy around education for students and how food gets accessed for kids and what the regulations are. And are they going to get stricter in terms of healthier local production around that?
Are we talking about school lunch specifically, or okay?
Any food that's coming into the school period.
Urvashi, do you have some thoughts on that from USDA perspective, especially?
Yeah, and just being from New York City, we have 1.2 million kids in the public school system, and New York City itself is actually big enough to operate independent of the state. So we are dealing with having, there's a whole program and initiative going on to increase education, increase even access to better foods and more local foods. There's also lots of wellness programs that operate in New York City, and I think this goes on a lot through the country. All to say that these often happen at the local level. This is not probably going to happen at the federal level at this point. But there's a lot of, I think, shining stars throughout the country. Chicago, LA, Boulder. There's a lot of school districts that have now really started to shift procurement in terms of getting better meat, better food, more local food. But that happens at an individual, usually the state or a big city level.
I think it's worth noting that the American School Lunch Program is USDA's biggest customer, and as long as our larger scale producers are overproducing, that's where our overproduction largely goes. So it's always hard to sort of figure out where the bottleneck
where it is, and each city has to go to USDA to get their school menu approved. So sorry I didn't give that last link, but everyone's got to have a dotted line to USDA, and school food is definitely regulated out of USDA.
Did you want to add something? Yeah.
Something that's kind of funny, but not really. When I was at USDA, we tried to get pizza out of school lunches. However, there were several representatives who said because tomato is healthy, it's a vegetable, that it was healthy for kids. So.
Did Ronald Reagan start that with ketchup?
He did, and we really tried to get it out because we did not want it in the school lunches, and we didn't win that battle.
And it doesn't even seem to have to do with political will as much, because nobody's going to argue that kids should not have good food. The challenges, though, are so high up the supply chain. So for instance, the one bit of USDA regulation I think that happened this year was that Purdue's USDA reintroduced flavored milk into the school lunch program so that they can now have chocolate and strawberry milk. But we have a dairy glut in this country, and dairy farmers have overproduced. That's one of the ways that we deal with it, is to permit as much dairy to flow into the school lunch program or the SNAP program or WIC as we can.
What question would each of you like to hear from a debate moderator for presidential candidates?
Oh man, that's such a good question. So the question was, what would each of us like to? What question would each of us like to hear from the debate moderators? Wow.
So many.
Yeah.
You start?
You could start. I'm trying to figure out one.
I don't know what the one question would be. I think, we talk about agricultural policy as agricultural policy, and it's very much constrained within food policy. And I think it's really important that we think about food policy as broader than just what happens on farms. Thinking about healthcare, thinking about housing. We know that the same challenges that we're facing around farmland access are similar to housing access, which is around the kind of commoditization of real estate and the financial pressures there. immigration rights is essential to food policy as well. So I don't know if I have one question. I would want a moderator to ask a question about food that isn't strictly about agricultural policy and kind of connects the dots to immigration, to climate change, to healthcare, to student loan debts. How do you connect your food policy with healthcare, climate change, immigration rights, etc.? That's the question I would ask.
My question goes back to what I was talking about earlier, which is what are you going to do to make sure that we can grow our food in soil and harvest our food after 50 years? Because if we're going at the rate we're going now, we're not going to get there. So what are you going to do about it?
For me, there needs to be a broader conversation about chemicals in our food system. I think we have allowing glyphosate into our food production is ludicrous to me, where it's banned in many other countries. So for me, I want to hear from the candidates about what they're going to do about Monsanto, how they're going to take Monsanto on. Another important issue that never gets brought up is trafficking. There's a huge problem with farm labor trafficking, and we do not address it in this country.
That's interesting. I'm going to ask two. One would be, how do you plan to build regional slaughter and processing economies so that four global meat packers don't own 80+% of the system? I think the other question would be, how do you plan to incentivize farmers to convert to regenerative agriculture? How do you plan to make it worth their while? Anything else? Burning. Oh, that's such a good and important question. Let me give you the mic on that.
I'm wondering what you think the pathway forward is for the USDA's research bodies, if you think that a change in administration could undo the damage done. Sorry.
I think we have seen a special decimation of our agencies over the last few years, and it's not that they were perfect to begin with, but these are the agencies that are charged with protecting our public health. And unfortunately, even prior to this administration, we sometimes see that industry really takes front and center. And part of that is because we have a bit of a revolving door going on with the agencies and a lot of the big industry players out there. It isn't to say that no one from the industry should work for government and no one from the government should work for industry, but it is astonishing to see the revolving door. And these days, of course, we're appointing those folks to actually lead agencies. So I think hopefully a change of administration can at least get some foundation back in place. And I think that we have so much research actually there that there's a lot to pick up and keep going with and process and understand. I also just want to mention that the FDA sacked their food advisory committee this past year, and they have 37 committees, and they don't have a food committee anymore. So I think hopefully, again, with changes in administration, we'll start to see some of these important these are they're part citizen, part company advisory committees back in place.
I just want to add to that. It's going to take a long time, though. If we switch over administrations, it's going to take some time. It's going to be hard for the next president to be able to do it in their first term. And I don't think people really understand that. I know when Obama came into office, there was a lot there, and everyone said, you guys aren't moving fast enough, you're not moving fast enough. It takes a lot of time. Going into every single one of the offices in the country and being able to get feedback from not only employees, but people in the field, it takes some time. So I would say in the next administration, if you have these concerns, be patient. But make sure that these issues are at the forefront when we're talking about it in this election. It can happen. I've seen it happen. It just takes some time.
I'm trying to think of a way to wrap up this conversation so we don't all have to go right to the bar after this. But, which that's where I'll be, so I'll see you there. The public has a role. My industry, media, has a role. At some point, it goes beyond, relying on regulators to do the right thing. And I don't know how you undo the damage of upending an entire agency's worth of independent researchers and moving them halfway across the country. I'm not totally sure what we do about that, except that I do think as a public, the demand ought to be for free access to unbiased information. It's one thing to ask for policy change, but it is another thing entirely to ask for what is actually our right as citizens of the country, which is access to information that allows us to hold our legislators accountable. So I guess on that power to the people note, that's the best way to think about policy, is how to humanize it, and that's something we're going to have to ask for. But my industry probably has the most significant role at this point in bringing that ERS move story to the fore and alerting citizens that our independent researchers are being silenced. And that is, if that's not going to keep us up at night, I don't know what is. Any other questions? Anything else? We have about 2 minutes. If not, I literally will see you at the bar.
Hi, I was wondering if you have one or two actions you'd say for our slow food chapters, what we should be asking our chapters to be doing, or possibly what you see the power of the slow food platform being in policy in 2020.
Do you work for Slow Food?
Actually, I do.
Good. That's a really good question. Any of the three of you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I think building coalition is really important, right? So connecting with farmers, connecting with lawmakers, connecting with other advocates, I think is really important. I think it can be really dire, but I think we've also seen that things happen with pressure, with public engagement, with folks voicing concerns, with proposing new policy, with bringing together large groups of people and diverse coalitions. So I would say there's a lot of work that everybody can do to look outside of their organization and really start building bridges with other like-minded groups, and also groups that may not necessarily agree, but are willing to have that conversation. I think there's more room for conversation, more room for coalition, and I think it can be effective.
I think where slow food has been especially strong is in the diversity conversation about lots of things, whether it's seeds, whether it's people, whether it's farmers, and making the connections between that principle and carbon sequestration and good policy and good food and all of those things. It's amazing how diversity connects into it, and it seems to me slow food is exactly well poised to be the ones to have that conversation. You're the ones who are kind of steeped in diversity all the time.
Yeah, I would have to agree with both of what they said. I also think we can't rely on the government. Don't rely on the government. I think it takes everyone here to be able to have those conversations and make change happen. We don't want to wait for it at the federal level.
Yeah, slow food is one of the best examples of community organizing that there is, organizing around shared principles of the treasure of biodiversity and the value of the people who are responsible for putting food on our plates. I'm so grateful to the three of you. I think we could have gone on and on. It's delightful to sit with three people who are as interested in regulation and policy as I am, especially this early in the morning. And thank you very much for your engaged attention, and have a wonderful rest of the day.